thank you for joining us at St. Nicholas Orthodox Church as we continue our study of the letter to the Hebrews. We are well into it now, and if you'd like to look at some previous studies, you can go onto our website, and if you click on the blog and look at the categories that says Bible study, you can find previous previous classes that we've done. What we're sharing with you tonight are excerpts from our online Bible study that we do on Zoom on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. If you'd like to take part in that Bible study, you're more than welcome to, and at the end of this video, you'll have some information about how you can register. Before we start, I just want to remind you that we are using Father Lawrence Farley's book on the letter to the Hebrews from his Orthodox Bible Study Companion Series as a guide. So if you hear me talk about Father Lawrence, that's who I'm talking about. The Orthodox Bible Study Companion Series is published by Ancient Faith Ministries, and you can find it at their website at ancientfaith.com. Father Lawrence has broken down his study into short sections, which is what we use as well as we go through the study. So the first section today is Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. Therefore, having a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore with boldness come near the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Before we start the study of the passage today, I'd like to talk about some background information first about the priesthood and its context within the wider life of God's people, because Christ, our high priest, is one of the main themes of the letter. But okay, why is that important? Where does it all fit in? So let's go all the way back to Exodus and Moses' encounter with God on Mount Sinai. Now, as we're looking at that encounter, the thing that we immediately comes to mind is that Moses receives the Ten Commandments, the 2 tablets of the law, which he did. But if you look at the book of Exodus, what you discover is Moses spent a lot of time on the mountain, and most of that time, God was giving Moses a plan for how his people should worship him. And so one of the things that he gives his people through Moses is a priesthood to lead the people in their worship of God. Moses' brother Aaron is the first priest, and of course he was as the first priest, he was also the high priest. Now, by the broadest definition, a priest is someone who offers a sacrifice to a deity on behalf of the people. In Israel, the priest made animal sacrifices to the living God for the sins of the people. And then among the priests, of course, is the high priest. He is the leader of the priests, and therefore he is also the spiritual leader of Israel, of the Jewish people. The one thing that the high priest did, and only the high priest did, it was his one right and obligation that was unique from the other priests, was that once a year on the Day of Atonement, which is called Yom Kippur, he would enter into the Holy of Holies. That was the only time anybody would go in there, and he would sprinkle blood from the sacrificed animal, and he would offer incense. So throughout the letter of the Hebrews, the author will make reference to this specific ministry and how it points to and how it's fulfilled by the person and the life of Jesus Christ. The first section we're going to look at today is Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 to 16. It's just 3 verses. This passage then continues to unpack the teaching of Christ as high priest. It reminds us of the first time we hear this brought up in the letter in chapter 2. Jesus is called a merciful, faithful high priest. Last time in chapter 3, Jesus is called the apostle and high priest of our confession. Here we learn that our high priest passed through the heavens. Now, in the Orthodox Study Bible, it relates this phrase to Jesus' ascension on the 40th day after his resurrection, when he ascends back into heaven to be seated with the Father. That connects with something that we read in chapter 1, verse 3, when it says that Christ sits at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So like we say in the Creed, he ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of the Father. So we have this high priest who passed through the heavens. And then we have this encouragement, this challenge here. Let us keep a firm hold on our confession of faith. Last week we talked about this. We also mentioned this confession, that it was a baptismal confession, the confession of Christ as Lord and God. St. John Chrysostom, writing about this, says, "Let us hold fast our confession." What sort of confession does he mean, St. John asks? That there is a resurrection, that there is a retribution, that there are good things innumerable, that Christ is God, that the Christian faith is right. These things let us profess, these things let us hold fast. And again, Hebrews is written to Jewish Christians who are wrestling with or who are drifting back to Judaism. And he's saying, hang on tight, keep a firm grip on your faith in Jesus Christ that you confessed at your baptism, and that then, presumably, you're going to live out through your life. Verse 15 says that this high priest, Christ, can sympathize with us. Sympathize means to suffer along with us, or to feel something, experience something along with us. And this connects to an idea that we find in the Church Fathers. It's the notion of co-suffering love, that the love of God is such that he doesn't just love us from separated from us to kind of look down and say, oh, I love you, and you're down there and I'm up here, but his love for us draws him into being with us in our struggles and in our difficulties. And it says here in verse 15 that he suffered temptation. He was tempted. Father Lawrence makes the point that the Greek here is pirazo, is the word, and he says it involves not just a temptation to sin, but any form of testing or trial. This is the same word, or this word has the same root in the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation. So again, it's not just don't let us sin, but it's deliverance from all kinds of trials and struggles and sorrows, chief among them sin. Last week I mentioned this saying of the Fathers that whatever is assumed by Christ can be healed by Christ, because wherever we find the divine physician, we find healing. So Jesus too was tempted, he was tested, but he did not succumb to the malady. He did not succumb to the wounds. So he's in all points tested as we are, but without sin, we read here. As I was preparing this, it reminded me of something that Father Thomas Hopko used to say. He said, orthodoxy is paradoxy. And what he meant by that was that when you look at the Christian faith, when you look at the Gospels, it's full of paradoxes. The last shall be first. The humble shall be exalted. Good leaders are the servants of all. Death brings us life. A virgin bears a child. And we have another paradox here, because we have the high priest who passed through the heavens is with us in our temptations and struggles and tests, and at the lowest moments of our lives. We are called in this passage to come before Christ, who is seated upon the throne of grace. So St. John Chrysostom asks, what throne of grace is he speaking of? That royal throne, concerning which he said, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit at my right hand. So again, in the Creed, he ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of the Father. That's the throne of grace. Now, again, because we're so separate from these things, we might miss the significance of this, because the posture of sitting in the ancient world was a sign of authority. The king sat on the throne, everybody else was standing. So the implication here, the teaching here, is that Jesus is high priest, but he's a royal high priest. He is the high priest and the king. Through Christ, we are allowed to come to that throne with boldness. That's verse 16. And Father Lawrence makes a very important observation. He says, our author reveals an essential characteristic of Christian worship, that of access with boldness. The word rendered here boldness is the Greek paresia, denoting a freedom of speech, a confidence of being accepted, permission to speak freely, as soldiers sometimes say. In and of ourselves, we do not have what it takes to approach the throne of the King on high. I'm always kind of amused when I hear people say, when I die, God's going to have to answer some questions. Because when you look at the scriptures, anybody that has an encounter with God ends up flat on their face. So Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah's vision of the Lord on his throne, and Isaiah's reaction to seeing the Lord on his throne is, woe is me, for I am undone, because I'm a man of unclean lips and dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. See, why am I undone? Because I've seen the King. That's the glory. And so we don't have what it takes to approach the King of glory. But God's grace and mercy fills up what is lacking in us and heals that which is broken in us. And through Christ, we can approach the throne. He is the source of our boldness. So if you think about the Divine Liturgy, right before the Lord's Prayer, the priest says, count us worthy, Master, with boldness to call upon you, the heavenly God, as Father. That we would make that bold statement and call upon you as Father. And so because we have this high priest who was like us in every way and experienced everything we did, because he's also the one that also passed through the heavens and ascended and transcended all of that through his actions, through his saving grace, we also may do the same, not in and of ourselves, but through him.
Our next section is Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 to 4. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed for men in the things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and deceived, since he himself was also subject to weakness. Because of this, he is required, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer sacrifices for sins. And no one takes this honor to himself, but he who is called by God, just as Aaron was.
So in this passage, we learn again that the work of the high priest is to offer up gifts, which are gifts of thanksgiving to God, and sacrifices, which are sacrifices for the forgiveness of people's sins. That's the main work of the priest. And then this unpacks exactly what does it take to be a high priest. Well, first of all, you have to be a man taken from God's people to serve God's people. That's verse 1. Verse 2, because he shares the common human experience, he can deal with the struggles of others with compassion, with gentleness, because he's there himself, he understands it, it allows him to be compassionate. Verse 3 tells us that the priest, the high priest, does not stand apart from the people to offer sacrifices. He stands with them because he is in just as much need of the forgiveness and the sacrifices as anyone else. Verse 4 tells us that the high priest does not assume this role himself. He does not take this on himself, that this honor and responsibilities are given to him by God. At the seminary that I went to in Canada, we had an icon above the doors of the chapel, and it was one of these icons it's called Christ the Teacher. So the book is open. He's holding a gospel book, which is open, and it's got a scripture passage in it. And the passage in this particular icon was John 15:16, which says, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and ordained you that you should go and bear fruit." It's not the high priest who's campaigning and wanting, having great aspirations of being the high priest. If God calls you to it, then you do it. And if he doesn't call you, then you don't do it. Now, Father Lawrence makes this really interesting observation here. He says, when we talk about the high priest, and I think somebody said it earlier, the high priest we know the most about, or the name that we're most familiar with, is Caiaphas, the high priest at the time of Jesus' passion. But he's not the gold standard for high priests. So this is Father Lawrence. He writes, to appreciate the office of high priest, one should read its description in Sirach 50. Sirach is one of the books of the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, which describes a more worthy incumbent, the high priest Simon, son of Onias. The author of Sirach describes him as glorious, surrounded by the people as he came out of the house of the curtain. That would be the Holy of Holies. It was behind a curtain. Like the morning star among the clouds, like the full moon at the festal season, like the sun shining on the temple of the Most High. When he received the portions from the hands of the priests, he was like a young cedar on Lebanon. Then Simon came down and raised his hands over the whole congregation of Israelites to pronounce the blessing of the Lord with his lips. And they bowed down in worship to receive the blessing from the Most High. And so Father Lawrence says this image, this description of the high priest shows us that the ministry of the high priest is an image of the glory of God. And ultimately, the high priest was a type. He was a pointer to Messiah, to the Savior, to Jesus Christ, the great high priest who ascended into the heavens and was one of us in all of our lowest and most broken points of our life.
And our final section today is chapter 5, verses 5 to 10. So also Christ did not glorify himself to become high priest, but it was he who appointed him, who said to him, "You are my son, today have I begotten you." And he also says in another place, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek," who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with vehement cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and was heard because of his reverence, though he was the Son, yet he learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And having been perfected, he became the author of eternal salvation to all who obey him, designated by God as high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek.
So in these verses, having in verses 1 to 4 outlined the basic characteristics, traits of the high priest, now the author demonstrates how Christ fits all of that, how he fits the bill, how he fulfills all the characteristics of the high priest. So first of all, verses 5 to 7, it's essentially saying that Jesus did not have his own personal ambitions to become high priest, that this office was given to him by the will of the Father as part of the divine plan for salvation. And the passage quotes 2 Psalms to show how his priesthood was appointed by the Father. Psalm 2, verse 7, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And Psalm 110, verse 4, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." Verses 7 to 8, we read that after becoming incarnate, that is, in the days of his flesh, out of his co-suffering love, in other words, being with us in trials and temptations, he learned obedience through that suffering, through those trials and temptations. Father Lawrence writes, he learned and experienced all the hard lessons of what it meant to obey God, even though such obedience cost him his life. For this reason, in verse 7, he says, "For this reason, our high priest offers up his prayers for us as fervent supplications to the Father." These cries and tears, and the Study Bible says that this is likely a reference to the prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And it was heard because of his reverence. And in Greek here, the word for reverence, the root of that word is to talk well. So he is heard because of how earnestly and wholeheartedly he puts himself into these intercessions for his people, into his intercessions for us. And that's such an important lesson about prayer, the persistent prayer for those who are in need. Verse 9, "Having been perfected, he became the source of salvation to all who obey him." And so this connects with something we read in Hebrews 2:10, that it was fitting for God to make the captain of our salvation perfect through sufferings. Perfected means to fulfill or to be completed. So it's the same word that Jesus uses on the cross when he says it is finished, and he hangs his head and he dies. And it is finished does not mean it's all over now, but it means that it has been perfected, it has been fulfilled, and it has been completed. So the idea here is that Jesus accomplishes our salvation not remotely, but from among us, within us, in our deepest experiences of pain and shame and isolation. And then verse 10 circles back to how the passage opened with Psalm 110. Christ is the high priest. No other priest is necessary. No other offering is necessary. And he is a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. We only hear of Melchizedek 3 times in the scriptures: in the Psalm, in the letter to the Hebrews, and in the book of Genesis. That's the first time, Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 to 20. Abraham, he's still called Abram at this time, goes out and frees his brother from captivity. He was kidnapped. He frees his brother. And when he comes back, Abram is visited by Melchizedek, who gives him an offering and blesses him. And that's all we hear. It's just 18, 19, 23 verses, and that's it. But then the author of the Hebrews builds on Melchizedek, and why is Melchizedek important, and how does he connect?
Everything we learn in the letter to the Hebrews about Jesus, the high priest and king, also applies to our own life as his disciples. And one of the most important lessons in the life of Christ is how he conforms to the will of the Father. This is what Christian discipleship is, conforming our will to God's will, what is known as synergy, a word that's been taken on by the corporate world these days, but has its roots in Christian spirituality. We find the fullness of life when we seek and struggle and strive to fulfill God's will for us in life. The saints teach us that if there's nothing else we can think of to pray for, it is enough to say these words: Lord, give what is needed, and in all things, thy will be done.
Hello, this is Father Andrew. You've just been watching some excerpts from one of our online Bible study sessions at St. Nicholas Church. If you'd like to join us on Zoom for a Bible study, you will be more than welcome. Just send me a message through the contact information on the screen. You can also find it in the notes below this video, and we would love for you to join us. Don't forget that you can also watch live streams of our Sunday services on Facebook, and if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you will be able to get other content like sermons and other videos that we post. Thanks for joining us today. Until next time, take care and God bless.